Hey, what's up? Zach here, and today I've got all the pros and cons of the all-new Jordan Luka 2, and there are quite a bit of material changes on the Luka 2s from the Luka 1s, a lot of departures from, his original signature. However, are any of those changes actually any better once you get the shoe on foot? Let's get right into it. Now, starting off in the uppers, the Luka 2s are, to me, quite a bit more maximalist than the Luka 1s. The thing I noticed right away was, number one, the thickness in the tongue. It is crazy padded. But number two, how bulky and substantial the lace eyelets are. It is an integrated lace eyelet system, kind of like the Nike Vapor 9 and 9.5s. But what I noticed is because the laces are also a little bit chunkier on these, they lace incredibly efficient. In some shoes, you're kind of just pulling and tugging and trying to get the shoe kind of uniformly snug. You pull the laces on this, the whole shoe gets snug around your foot. Really was a nice sensation on foot, just having that whole shoe just kind of compress around you. That has some implications for fit, obviously, but that initial sensation, that feeling of containment is just fantastic. And one of the key reasons that lace line is so efficient is because it is then stitched into the foxing that goes all the way up over the toe box, comes around the heel, and then is stitched here underneath of the shank, which actually comes from underneath the shoe, wraps up all the way over the uppers in two distinct spots. So it's no wonder the shoe is locking down so efficiently. Now, if you look at the meshing area of the Luka 2s under the microscope, now it looks like it's not going to breathe whatsoever. However, if you flip it underneath and actually look at the teardown, there is a mesh netting underneath there, almost like a braiding underneath of that layer of the uppers. So you look at the breathability test, they only heated up 120.1 degrees and then cooled down another 68 degrees, which really was disproportionate in terms of cooling versus, the 120 degrees of heating, which really wasn't all that much for how substantial the uppers are, how thick the tongue is, just how much material is on them. Now, I will say these do trap a lot of moisture, although they don't heat up all that much. Like I said, they do get a little boggy. When I was out on court, the court temperature was crazy high. My GoPro was shutting off because it was so hot. However, my feet did not feel hot. So in the real world, yeah, they're not a hot shoe, but even after hours of having them off, I kind of just felt them and they were still kind of soggy. So if you are going to use these outdoors, don't worry about the heat, but definitely have a plan to get the moisture out of them. And on the upper durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, woof. I did it on the foam as well as on the stitching layer. And number one, the burr just rips right through the stitches. And then number two, just pummels right through the foam. Now, on an indoor court, I don't see these wearing down nearly as fast. I think that the coefficient of friction will be low enough on that stitching layer and on the foam, it'll be okay. However, on an outdoor court, if you do drag and you do get a lot of pronation out of yourself when you drag, get ready to start ripping the uppers on these. Now, looking at the midsole of the Luka 2s and the teardown, this is why I'm glad I always do the bounce height test prior to completing the teardown, because you look at the bounce height test, 29.5 centimeters in the heel, which seems pretty normal for Phylon, Formula 23, that's what I normally get. But you look at the forefoot, 40 centimeters of bounce height in the forefoot, which is akin to Zoom Air or super shoe type foam. So I go back to tear them down thinking there's gonna be something crazy in the forefoot, a slab of foam or something that I just wasn't aware of prior to cutting them open. And no, it is just Formula 23 with a Phylon carrier. However, it definitely seems like the Formula 23 that is in the Luka 2s has been tuned a little differently. Nike is maybe doing something a little different with their Formula 23 these days. Now, in the rear foot, I think the reason that it got, a little bit of a lower bounce height is because, that ball bearing is hitting, somewhere between the Formula 23 and the Phylon carriers. So the height of the bounce is gonna reflect both the Formula 23 as well as just that Phylon carrier. However, in the forefoot, because it is just striking Formula 23, it's bouncing like crazy. Now, I noticed this on court with these, the bounciness of them just seemed a little bit more springy. It felt like there was, almost like a bounce house underneath of me. It didn't feel super plush, it didn't feel super dense, but it felt like, an air mattress that was just, blown up super tight, or a bouncy house that was blown up super tight. Now, that was also reflected here in the insole, which is Dream Cell, which is an open cell polyurethane. Now, I think this also kind of aided in that feeling underneath the foot, but really no denying what that Formula 23 is doing under there. And I think that, a lot of people probably complained about the Formula 23 in some of their previous shoes. Is it just that a full length of it allows it to extract more bounce, right? Is it allowed to kind of do its thing better? I'm not really sure. But the most nuts part of the midsole teardown is actually in the heel counter. This is the thickest heel counter I think I have ever seen. Now, the KD15 actually has that same bulge from the outside, but that bulging in the KD 15 is foam, whereas in the Luka 2, it's all plastic, which just gives a tremendous amount of side-to-side security, especially because in the Luka 2s, like the Luka 1s, the shank is bottom-loaded really thin and really only starts in the midfoot, then flares out into the distal lateral forefoot. But having that heel counter that just keeps you so stable back here, especially with the 2 layers of foam here too, really shows that, you know, Jordan Brand put a premium on where the shoe needed to be strongest and why. And like I said, we'll talk about that in the playability section. Before I get into the outsole, I do want to make mention of the red portion of the carrier foam. I will get into that in the playability section, but to explain it, you kind of have to talk about the performance of the shoe. But getting into the outsole tread, kind of similar to the Luka 1, it's a more triangular wave, which is kind of an oxymoron. You have one a little bit more protruding area here in the distal medial forefoot. I think that might be why the rubber is not continuous here in the forefoot. Now, when you get into the heel of the shoe, it does become just a little bit more linear treads, and these treads are very thin. If you look at the outsole durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, you get about 1 millimeter of damage, which isn't really the problem. It's just that the tread lines are so thin and so exposed that keeping them on an outdoor court, it is gonna start to wear them down a little bit more. The grip on outdoor courts, even slick outdoor courts, fantastic. On indoor hardwood, going side to side, the grip is really exceptional. Going front to back, it's just okay, it's good, it's nothing, you know, crazy, but I will say having those linear treads does allow this shoe to get up off the blocks really easily, allows it to go coast to coast on the court really efficiently, because just the airflow down there is really easy, they're not sticking to the court really hard, so if you are trying to get on a fast break, this is also a very nice shoe for you. And speaking of those fast breaks, you look at the speed ratio of the Luka 2, comes in at a 2.12, which would have been higher if the uppers weren't so substantial and heavy. So you are sacrificing a little bit in terms of nimbleness, light of footedness, and speed for a little more containment in the uppers. But of course, talking the all-important fit of the Luka 2s. Now, when I was just walking around in them, it didn't bother me at all in my standard size. However, when you start swelling in them, that's when you start to see some of the issues for a wider foot. If you are a narrow medium, true to size is fine. However, if you are a 2E, I probably would be going up half size on these. If you're a bunion, or specifically a Taylor's bunion, or have a really just bulky lateral midfoot, this plastic piece is just not gonna break in. Now, if you are somebody with a snake bitten foot, these are kind of deceiving because they are just kind of so bouncy and tightly tuned. That does mean that there's not as much shock absorption in these. So if you want to get the best of these in terms of kind of their side to side, and you know, for a streamlined shoe, they're really good for an ankle sprainer because of the containment. You know, if you want a shoe with this profile, probably would be throwing an orthotic in these. They lock down well enough for an orthotic. And speaking of all the ways your foot can hurt, if you have had an injured foot and ankle for a long time, have not been able to get a solid answer as to kind of what to do about it, or even what your diagnosis is, and want to talk to someone that, you know, kind of lives and breathes this community, I do offer consulting services in the description below, so check that out if you are one of those people. And last but not least, getting into the playability of the Luka 2s. I know this is going to sound either cliche, just unbelievably obvious, or like marketing jargon, but the Luka 2s are meant to be used with one foot. They are meant to do their best work when all of your body weight is on one limb. Namely, when you're making a very hard cut or step back, when you're trying to change directions or creating space. And I know, you know, the quintessential picture of Luka Doncic is that of his forefoot bulging out of the shoe because he's putting so much weight there into the distal forefoot of the shoe. Look at how the shank is shaped in the shoe. Look at where all the pivot points on the shoe are. And talking about the carrier foam here, this red foam we talked about in midsole teardown, it almost looks like the Jordan 38, kind of where the Air Zoom comes up, but it's foam here. And what I notice is when you tear it down, this foam here is vacuolated. There's holes in it to make it more forgiving when you come and press down on it, so it's, you know, a little less shock coming up your legs. So every design and material choice on this shoe is meant so that the shoe does not buckle when you're putting all of that force and body weight into it. And that's the biggest reason why the heel counter on these is so stiff. It's what is keeping the rear foot from buckling when you're putting all that force into the forefoot. So the shoe doesn't just rapidly internally rotate on you, it keeps its structure. But also, you know, I think with Luka, he doesn't want a shoe that's overly bulky, overly kind of, you know, wide and clunky, because then he can't get as nimble. Whereas the Luka 2s kind of straddle that line, right? They are pretty streamlined. They're not super maximalist, but they're also not super minimalist either. And I think that the Luka 2 definitely beefed up that shoe, probably from number one, his feedback, but also other players' feedback as well. Whereas in the ones, you know, you really could buckle that shoe. Whereas in these ones, it's kind of hard to make this shoe collapse on itself. I know my step backs are nothing to write home about. However, for a shoe that's, you know, kind of this streamlined, you know, shoe didn't buckle at all, and I had really no worries about rolling over my ankle. So, you know, kudos to Jordan Brand for putting the right stuff in the right places for the Luka 2. I will say, if you liked the Luka 1 and its weight and profile, this is going to be a clunkier model for you, so just kind of watch out for that. But, you know, I think if you're someone playing guard or wing and just need something that you can lean on, no pun intended, this is a really good pickup. But let me know in the comments down below, you know, are you not a fan of them in kind of increasing the heft, increasing the maximalism of the shoe, or are you someone that kind of wanted more of that? Let me know down below. And if you want to see what basketball shoes I think are the 5 best right now, make sure you click into this video up above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam, and I'll see you somewhere in the Sneakerverse.